I've heard a lot from you about what's happening in the Middle East. We have not been able to pass any humanitarian package that can help the Middle East, and we have not been able to pass anything that would address that. As we are 2 months out since the brutal, savage attack on October 7 that the terrorist group Hamas committed against innocent Israelis just north of Gaza, we have seen Israel, in its right to defend itself, go after Hamas. I value any innocent Palestinian life in Gaza the same way I value any innocent life in Israel. And I will continue to expect that as Israel defends itself and seeks to root out Hamas and its ability to carry out an attack like this again, that we have an expectation and Israel has a primary responsibility to make sure it protects against innocent life. The ranking member, that means the highest level Democrat of the Foreign Affairs Committee, sent a letter to the administration urging them to make sure that any defense systems that we provide to any country in the world, including Israel, would require that that country follows human rights laws, including protecting innocent people in conflict. And so I signed that because I do vehemently and fervently believe that the Palestinian people have every right to expect that they would be protected as Israelis would themselves. Recently, I sent a letter to President Biden and Secretary Blinken expressing concern about the effects on babies and children of the Israel-Hamas war and urging the administration to do everything possible to free hostages, but also protect Palestinian children and infants. Also, I led my own letter and had about 60 Democratic colleagues join me in telling President Biden and Secretary Blinken that we must press the Israeli government to crack down on extremist settler violence that is occurring in the West Bank, and that those extremist settlers, who some of them are being sanctioned rightfully, should not see the conflict in Gaza as an opportunity to push farther into the West Bank and displace innocent Palestinian people. To me, support of a ceasefire means that both sides have negotiated, that the hostages are released, and that Hamas, a terrorist organization, surrenders and lays down its arms. It is not a question of whether Israel should level Gaza or whether we just blanketly say Israel is a genocidal state that's committing apartheid and reduce ourselves to anti-Semitic slurs. Those seem to be two popular corners right now, and I think all of us are better than that. The first individual is Spojmi Naziri, who is of Pleasanton, California.
Our hearts break, both for the Israeli and the Palestinian hostages, and innocent people should not be kept away from their families or killed. This collective punishment campaign undermines the two-state solution you have advocated for over the years, and I'm grateful for that. What prevents you from calling for a permanent ceasefire in Palestine, knowing that a military solution isn't viable, where this offense will only lead to more death and destruction of life on both sides?
I would first say I supported the ceasefire that existed a couple weeks back. That was productive. We saw aid coming in for the Palestinian people. We saw hostages returned to Israel. Some of you have cited my colleagues who've called for a ceasefire, but many of them who've called for a ceasefire have not signed on to the ceasefire resolution, which I believe only has 18 members of the House of Representatives of 435 who have signed on. So it's clear to me that there's different interpretations of ceasefire. To me, as I said, it means Hamas returns every hostage, Hamas surrenders, Israel stops any attacks in Gaza. I will also note, though, as I understand it, we've only had one vote to give Israel aid for this conflict. I voted against it because it did not include humanitarian aid for Palestinians, and it did not get a vote at all in the Senate. So Israel is not using new funds from the U.S. at this point for its conflict in Gaza. We have given it funds in the past for defending itself with Iron Dome, but there have been no new funds allocated to Israel since this conflict began. The next question, I believe, is going to come from Manav Patel from Livermore, representing the National Iranian American Council.
So the situation in Palestine right now is horrifying. For me, it's impossible to understand how this slaughter could be of any benefit to the United States, Israel, the EU, or the wider world when the target of these attacks are children. I hope you will consider your position on a ceasefire and also ask that you warn against an escalation to a broader regional war. Is that something you can do? Will you consider supporting conditional aid to Israel in line with existing standards for other countries like the Leahy Law?
And that's the letter that I sent, essentially saying that the Leahy Law, which expects every country and requires every country that receives U.S. aid, follows human rights practices. I want a ceasefire, but I want those hostages returned. I want Hamas disarmed. And to me, that means Israel, when that happens, should not further target Hamas in Gaza. I'll also say, though, there was a ceasefire in place for 800 plus days. That ceasefire was broken when Hamas savagely went into Israel and murdered women and babies and a pregnant woman, for example, and kidnapped babies and children and the elderly. I want to get back to the ceasefire, but I don't want to see Hamas able to carry out an attack like this again. Sandra Nasser from Castro Valley.
My name is Sandra Nasser. I'm a Palestinian American, and like all Palestinians, I am beyond heartbroken to see what is happening to the innocent civilians in Palestine. Congressman Swalwell, I have written to you many times since October 7th, and you have repeatedly responded with how horrified you are about the attacks committed in Israel. My question to you is, are you not horrified by the genocide taking place? You responded also and said that you are disgusted with the barbaric attacks by Hamas. Again, I ask, do you not see that 66 days of constant bombardment on a besieged population of 2.3 million people as anything other than barbaric? Congressman, in your letter, you also said that Israel has a right to defend itself. I ask you, from whom? From doctors, professors, poets, journalists, mothers, babies? Because those are the people Israel is targeting. It's an outrage that our government, with billions of our tax dollars and with support of most of our representatives, including you, still dares to stand with what I call the rabid government of Israel. What has become apparent is that these crimes happening before our eyes, with the blessing and full financial support of the U.S. government, are putting us all at risk. Congressman Swalwell, in your reply, you have also said, and I quote, "Innocent Gazan Palestinians are as worthy of our empathy and support as an Israeli family on the other side of the security perimeter." My question to you is, how do you expect us to believe that you have any empathy and support for us when you cannot utter the word ceasefire? We are simply asking you, as our representative, to stop rendering us invisible, and we demand that you call for a ceasefire now. Furthermore, I need to clarify that what you refer to as a security perimeter is more aptly called an apartheid wall by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and has for 17 years kept over 2 million people caged in an open-air prison. No one can get in or out of Gaza. And finally, I ask, why? Why do you continue to minimize our suffering and the suffering of the Palestinian people, those who are brutally occupied? We are here to demand a permanent and an immediate ceasefire.
I do have empathy for you and the Palestinian people. And frankly, I think it's when people level charges like that someone is complicit or they don't have empathy. That's what reduces this conversation and takes it to a place where there's no understanding. And frankly, it's a lack of empathy. You're not invisible to me at all. And there's nothing about my 11-year record on this issue or standing up for the Muslim people that any person could say and pass a lie detector test that I believe the Palestinian or Muslim community is invisible. I think we have a different interpretation of what ceasefire means. I support a permanent ceasefire where hostages are released and Hamas surrenders. Innocent Palestinians who have been killed in this conflict, it's horrifying. And that's why I will continue to sign on to letters or legislation that go at that issue. But it's also horrifying to me that mothers are in captivity right now and held by Hamas. Anyone on that side wants to also know, do you believe that Hamas should return those hostages? And yes, Israel has a right to defend itself. It does not have a right to target innocent Palestinians. And when I say there's complexity in this issue, to me, as a 8-year member of the Intelligence Committee, a member of the Homeland Security Committee, and just somebody who reads the newspaper, there's no question that Hamas has embedded itself into civilian populations. That doesn't mean you don't have an obligation as Israel to protect against the loss of innocent life, but it certainly makes it more complex as you try and go after an actor like Hamas. And so I want a permanent ceasefire, but I want hostages returned and I want Hamas to surrender. I'm pro-Palestinian and anti-Hamas. Our last question will come from Mac Levine.
I'm a father myself. I'm a husband. I'm a Jew. and I'm an anti-Zionist. In light of your vote on Resolution 894, which directly conflates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, I'm very interested in what you would call me, a Jewish person who is anti-Zionist. Your answer to this question is very likely to be rooted in Israel having a right to exist, and that's probably what your support of the resolution has to do with. In what form does Israel or any state, for that matter, have the right to exist? The formal structure of the government, the formal structure of society, it feels like you are not demonstrating the appropriate amount of empathy. You are asserting that Israel's motivation is rooting out Hamas, and you used the passive voice consistently when speaking about the loss of life in Palestine. When you reach this kind of civilian death toll, should those motivations come into question? And if you're to demonstrate empathy for somebody and acknowledge that like what's happened to their children, what's happened to their extended family as deeply brutal, inhumane, you have to identify an actor behind that violence. And when you do it with a passive voice, I believe that it demonstrates a lack of empathy. And when you sort of take a government's motivation at face value, then I believe too that demonstrates a lack of empathy. As an anti-Zionist, like I believe we have to be critical of any state's stated intention, especially Israel, whose behavior is an indictment of me in many ways to many people and the Jewish diaspora. I just feel that it's a moral imperative to do so. I thought it was important to push back on this assertion that like claiming that there's a lack of empathy makes these kinds of conversations impossible. If you're a person who wants to apply abstract principles like self-determination, like the right to safety, like the right to one's home, if you want to apply that like broadly speaking, especially to everybody who lives in areas under Israel's control, I would expect from you a more forceful condemnation of the violence that Israel is waging, and to not use the passive voice, and to not just toe the line that says Israel's sole motives are rooting out Hamas, that perhaps it's time to start speaking about this a little bit differently. And I know you're not going to use the word genocide. I don't expect that from you. But if you want to demonstrate empathy for all of your constituents, including Sandra, Congressman, frankly, I think it's imperative that you simply say Israel is committing crimes.
To me, Zionism represents the right of the Jewish people to have their own state. It does not represent support for the Israeli government. I have been face-to-face a number of times with Prime Minister Netanyahu, including earlier this year, and I have told him that I don't agree with his policies on settlements or his lack of support for a two-state solution. But the idea that, especially after the Holocaust, the Jewish people have a right to have their own state is what, in my interpretation, Zionism is about. I don't believe it is anti-Semitic to criticize the Israeli government. I think that is patriotic to criticize your government. That's your right. This question of empathy, it's interesting that you think you know what I feel for and what I don't. I think what this is really about is you just don't agree with me on what I believe is the solution. And that's different than empathy. Like we both can care about what's happening, but we both have different interpretations of what the outcome can be. But that doesn't mean that I question your empathy. The issue is you don't like how I define ceasefire, and that's fine. That's your right. And I will tell you, and my pledge to all of you is that I will continue to be open-minded and believe that my position on this can change as the events change. As to the passive voice, that was not by any intention or intent. Ed R. asked the question that many of you asked. What prevents you from following your colleague Ro Khanna's call for a permanent ceasefire in Palestine, knowing that a military solution isn't viable and where this offensive will only create further loss of innocent life as well as rage and radicalization? Don't you think this collective punishment campaign undermines the two-state solution you've advocated for? I'll have my staff fact check this for me. I don't think Ro Khanna is on the ceasefire resolution. And yes, I do believe that Israel risks jeopardizing any future of a two-state solution as innocent lives, to use the active voice, are taken in this conflict. And you also risk giving Hamas what their goal is, which is, I think, one of the earlier speakers pointed out, to have a regional conflict that the United States gets drawn into. Bill from Hayward. I believe that the United States must require that Israel publicly acknowledge their goal of a two-state solution before any more U.S. money is sent to Israel. Please comment directly on this restriction. I support a two-state solution. I want a two-state solution. I've told the Prime Minister eye to eye that I want to see that happen, and I do believe that the United States needs to more assertively expect that from Israel. Sam from Hayward. My question pertains to the matter of foreign aid, specifically the significant disparity between the amount designated for Gaza and that allocated to Israel. While $100 million in humanitarian aid for Gaza is undoubtedly valuable, it is a mere fraction of what is truly needed to rebuild the devastated infrastructure, hospitals, roads, schools, and homes in Gaza. The residents of Gaza are grateful for the support, but it's clear that much more assistance is required. I 100% agree and will support the rebuilding of Gaza and the idea that the Palestinian people deserve as much as wants the Jewish people who are in Israel to live in security and economic prosperity, and the people should have the same opportunity and security.